Test, test, test. Our next book in 10 minutes is the infamous Brave New World, written in 1932 by Aldous Huxley, one of the global elite that we've highlighted in many of our videos. And of course, you can't get into this book and understand it without understanding that it's a real plan. He says at the beginning of this book in the introductory essay that you shouldn't think of this as a pure fiction story, but rather as a story about how the future will actually be. And he knew this because his brother, for example, Julian, wrote the philosophy of UNESCO. And that means that the global institutions that were being set up at that time were literally formulated and given their ethos, their impetus by people like the Huxleys and the Rockefellers. So we should pay attention to the kind of world that they say is being erected. The first thing that he mentions in the introductory essay is that the world that will come to be is going to be based on the utilitarian happiness principle. You being in a coon pod, you getting your feelies, and you getting intravenous vitamins pumped into you in your coffin apartment.
By Mark Zuckerberg. It's going to be great when you're in the coon pod and I can put vitamins in you intravenously.
Right? That kind of a world is what we're talking about. And that's what Brave New World describes. A world where humans are controlled on the basis of the pleasure principle. And so one of the things that is mandated in Brave New World is that you cannot turn people down for lovey-dovey time. You have to sleep with everybody, because if you don't, you're a bigot. So it's almost like mandated, state-mandated humping time. The book begins with the structures that they put in place in London to control what they call a world socialist dictatorship. It's a Soviet-style / pleasure principle future where everything is free in the sense of you have universal basic income, this kind of a thing. And humans come to be in this world state, so it's a global government on the basis of hatcheries, or they come out of pods, they come out of labs. Nobody is born in a normal mother or female way. So there's already, you can see a kind of a displacement of gender, a displacement of classical biology. What we have here is a kind of a clone army, right? Where the human population is now disconnected. And one of the reasons for that, according to Huxley, was that if you don't have a mom and a dad, then your new mommy, daddy, nanny state becomes the stand-in for your parents and your archetypal familial structure. So in other words, the total control of population and reduction is the centerpiece of this whole future society of Brave New World. It's a neo-Pavlovian social Darwinian system wherein everybody in the book has a name typically that's significant in terms of the philosophy of the book. For example, there's Lenina, and she's named after Lenin. There's Bernard Marx, named after Karl Marx. So the society that we're speaking about here is one that has perfected the scientific technique of social engineering. And there's even references to MK Ultra where they talk about electroshocking infants to condition them. So social conditioning is something that has been absolutely perfected. And it's used on a mass scale for the whole world. And we know that the chief antagonist, the character Mustafa Mond, who is one of several world socialist controllers, speaks at length of all of these techniques. We have other Fabian socialists being mentioned, like George Bernard Shaw, as the model for this world system that they've built. And it's also important to keep in mind that it's a technocracy. This technocracy has divided society into specific, clear categories of hierarchies: alphas, betas, gammas, deltas, etc. You're color-coded in this system. And so the irony is that the revolutions that have occurred since, say, the French Revolution were supposedly about equality and fairness, liberty, equality, fraternity. However, in reality, as Huxley shows in his novel, the final revolution, which is the final Brave New World society, that is the final revolution. When it comes in, it will actually be one based on a rigid scientific hierarchy, a genetic, eugenic-based hierarchy. In this system, there is a new world religion, and amazingly, the world religion that's concocted and created revolves around odd hallucinogenic drugs that are kind of combined with something like MDMA. It's unclear, but it's a made-up drug called Soma that has the effects of those two, LSD and MDMA. But they have an SEX magic ritual. I thought that was interesting because if you don't know, of course, Huxley was in the circles of Aleister Crowley, and they were friends. And they actually went to parties together. And so I would assume that that's where he got this new Soma sacrament of magical butt sex. Humans are viewed in this society as a zoo, and they have to thus be culled on a mass scale, population tightly controlled. In fact, there's even references to Whitehall as the control office. As we said, it takes place essentially in London. We read about weather engineering, weather control. So this is a future society that has everything, at least in terms of human problems, biological problems in the sense of like disease and sickness solved, but it's extremely immoral. And even Huxley, who ultimately I think was a part of all of this system, even though he's kind of somewhat critiquing it in this book, he's basically admitting that it's still kind of fundamentally immoral. We even learned that in the future, you don't read things like Shakespeare. You don't read things like the Bible. You don't read classic texts because classic texts are not amenable to the world's socialist control structure. We're actually seeing all of this now. They're calling for the banning of the canon of Western literature. They need to be censored. They need to be deleted. And that's why it's very important to have hard copies of books, because there is coming a day when it will be a Fahrenheit 451 scenario where books will be probably outlawed. You won't be able to have those things, and a scientific technocratic dictatorship like Brave New World might actually be in control. I thought it was funny too that there's also movies, and they're basically just like prawn versions of Michael Bay. It's like explosions and TNA, and that's it. And they talk about them as, they call them feelies, I think. But the weird part is that it also mentions in the novel a breakaway civilization. There's an island for people who wake up and figure out what's going on, who don't fit into the strict five-tier or the class system that they've rigidly structured. One of the other amazing elements is the discussion between John the Savage, one of the characters who grows up outside of the world social system and what they call a reservation or kind of a zoo. And John the Savage is having this discussion about some of the books he had read, like Shakespeare and the Bible, with Mustafa Mond. And Mustafa Mond admits that science is a control system. Doesn't mean that there's not real science, but he says that we rigidly control and censor and hide real science and real scientific discoveries. He says, in fact, sometimes our scientists discover truths that are not amenable to the scientific atheist dictatorship. He says that they even prove and discover metaphysical truths at times. And he says that when they do discover that, we rigidly censor, control, and shut them down. Because atheism and scientism and dialectical materialism are social control structures in the Brave New World society. Now, there's a lot of other deep esoteric elements where we find Mustafa Mond pushing what might be called radical PEDO types of sexuality in the book. And I didn't notice that, in the past reading it, but reading it now, it's all the more prophetic and all the more relevant to today's society. And I think that if you're looking for a really predictive book, probably the most predictive book out there, a lot of science fiction, a lot of the novels, a lot of the dystopias that we cover, they have a lot of predictions. I wrote a whole book on that called Esoteric Hollywood. If you've not read it, I recommend going and getting my book, Esoteric Hollywood, at my website, as well as part 2 and the other texts that I've written there, because I go into detail about how this works. Also, if you want to beef up your testosterone, head on over to chalk.com. That's my web sponsor. And you can get some of this 7 Wonders. I highly recommend 7 Wonders, or the Sheila Jit, or my favorite, the Tomcat Elite. Use the promo code J50 to get 50% off all of those excellent products over at chalk.com. That's CHOQ.com. And use the promo code J53Life. That's J53LIFE to get 53% off any recurring subscriptions. And I know you're going to want recurring subscriptions. In fact, the Brave New World Society is a tightly controlled and a very soy society. So if you want to combat that with your own toxic masculinity, head on over to chalk.com.